Thank you for joining me for this morning's little how-to video. Today we're going to talk about gesso. I'm going to give you a little rundown on what it actually is and several ways to go ahead and use it. I thought that would be fun for today's how-to project. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So there are several things to know about gesso. First of all, it comes in white, it comes in black, and it comes in clear, and its basic primary use is as a primer. You want to use it to cover most things up is what it's actually used for. It is safe for acrylics and paints. It's non-yellowing, non-cracking. It dries pretty fast, and you can actually do it inside. There's no chemicals or bad smells or anything like that. So that's just some rundown on your actual gesso. And one of the easiest ways to use gesso is to use it as a primer. That's its main purpose. There are several ways to do this, and it's kind of fun because you can take a piece of paper or a magazine or an old book or something like that, and obviously the paper's pretty thin most of the time, so a gesso can actually be used to thicken the paper and to prime it so that you can actually paint on it and everything, so that the paper doesn't crinkle and wrinkle when it gets wet from the paint surfaces and everything. So there are several ways that you can do this. You can use a brush stroke with just any kind of brush. You can do some, padding on there. If you want some texture with a sponge, you can actually go ahead and just kind of rub it around and get some texture on there as well. You can use a brayer. You just put some gesso on here and kind of roll it over the top. You could also use a paint roller as well. Each one will give you a little bit different texture, different thickness and consistency as well. So just kind of play around with that. Today I'm just going to kind of use my little brush here for a minute. And this is my gesso. So the thing that I love using it for is I typically will use it in an art journal. So I'm just going to get a little tiny bit on here, and you just kind of go over the top of it. And it just depends on how much of that background surface you want to be able to see. If you don't want to see any of it, you would use a thicker surface. Just paint a couple of layers on after they dry. If you want to see it, see how it's doing a really great job of actually lightening the pattern. This is really great for someone who's got a pattern that they love, but they don't really want it to show very much through their artwork. So you can really lighten it down. You could also do this in different layers. So you can use a piece that's really bright, and then you can lighten it a little bit, and maybe you lighten it a little bit more in certain areas. It all depends on how you want to go ahead and do it. I'm just going to use a little sponge and show you what it looks like here on the bottom here. So you can also use it to create, a tiny bit of dimension, some layers, some fun swirlies. It does exactly the same thing. It just depends on how you want to actually get it onto the paper. So as you can see, this one looks a little swirled. This one here is nice and flat and straight. So it just depends on how you want to put it on there. If you use it on a paint roller or a brayer, you're going to get different patterns. So I'm just painting it on here real quick. So you can just put it on here and you kind of roll it out. And you see how you get these bold texture lines? That's kind of nice in certain artwork. And you can keep going over the top of it over and over again until it lightens a little bit and it causes a little tiny bit of texture. You can kind of just see it right here. I don't know how well you can see it on the video, but you can just barely see some texture on there. Okay. Now, the great thing about gesso as a primer is that you can pretty much use it on any object. I mean, that's what it's used for. It's to prime your surface, canvas, real life leaf once you've dried it. I've got a bunch of different stuff here. This is cardboard, this is hot glue, these are both chipboards, this is a metal gear, this here is made out of egg cartons, and these are fabric flowers. And basically you're just going to take your gesso and you're just going to go over the top of all of these objects, and it's going to prime the surface so that you can put color on them or glitter on them, or whatever it is that you need to do to them. So you just kind of go over the top of everything. And if it's not thick enough, you can go back and do a second layer after everything dries. If you don't want to see any of the color underneath everything, you can go back and do it. If you want some of the coloring to show through on these objects, you know, just do a very, very light little wash of it so that you get a little bit of the color still left in there. So I'm not going to do the entire thing right now, but just so you can see kind of what's happening. Like I said, you can paint over pretty much any object. It doesn't matter if it's plastic, metal, glossy. Some surfaces, they will tend to scratch off a little bit more, like your glossy surfaces and everything. So just be aware of that, but they will actually work really well, especially once you get the paint on there usually. Just give it a couple of layers. Let it dry in between, couple more layers, and then you should be all good to go. It'll cover up anything you want. So another great way you can use gesso is to actually substitute it as a white paint. Say you don't have any laying around at the moment. You can actually use it just like you would white paint. You can use it to make texture marks. You can use it to make paint. Like you can actually take a paintbrush and paint with it just like you would anything else. You can use it just simply, you know, paint details. You could write with it. It depends on, you know, what you want to do with it in the background and everything. It makes a really good substitute for white paint. Another great way to use gesso as a paint is to add it to paint. So I'm just going to take a basic acrylic right here. I'm just going to put a little tiny bit of white gesso down. And what this does is it actually lets you lighten your paint. This would be the same thing as if you were adding white paint to your acrylic. It'll do the same exact thing. It'll actually just lighten it a little tiny bit. The good thing about gesso is it also acts as that primer still. So you're giving your surface a primed, colored layer. Instead of just adding a layer of acrylic to it, you're actually adding a primer. And you're lightening that color. So now here's your new color. Another great thing you can do with gesso is to actually use it as a wash. So instead of, once you got your layer, or say you have a really nice, you know, background that you want that's semi-thick already, and you just want a very, very thin layer of gesso on it, you can actually take a little tiny bit of gesso and you can add some water to it. And it'll actually thin out your gesso. So you get a really, really nice wash. So gesso's pretty thin as it is. You don't typically need to do a white wash over the top. But sometimes, every once in a while, you want something that's just really, really super thin white color over the top. So this will just give you a very, very light washing of white. Now make sure when you do this, the surface that you're doing it on is actually semi-thick already, or able to take water pretty well. Like if you have a piece of watercolor, it'll work really well. If you have a piece of an old book, it's not going to work as well because it will soak up a lot of that water. So just be really careful with that, okay? So one of my favorite ways to actually use gesso is to create texture with it, because it gives you a really cool texture that you can actually add paint or whatever else over the top of it afterwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my little sponge. I'm just going to dip it in my gesso. And then I'm just going to create texture just by squishing it around on here. And this makes a lovely texture. You can actually see all that rich, nice texture on there. It gives you a really great look. Another way you can use it for texture is you can actually take a brayer, which I got here. I'm just going to put a little bit of paint on it. We kind of looked at this a little earlier, but I'm going to do it again. So you just paint a little tiny bit onto the brayer. And then you just roll it on there. And depending on how thick you make your paint when you paint it on the surface, It'll actually kind of smudge, it'll kind of roll. It just depends on how you're actually doing it and how much you're using. But you can see that really cool texture where you can tell the actual roller went over the top of it. A paint roller, yeah, like a paint roller like you would use to paint your house and everything, it'll give you a combination of kind of in between these two textures, which is kind of cool to play with as well. And another great way to use your gesso to create texture is with a stencil. So, you know, you just have your little stencil here. And I'm just going to take a flat object. This is an old business card I have laying around. You could also use a palette knife. I'm just going to take a little bit of gesso here. And I'm just going to very lightly smudge it through the stencil. And you don't want to get a whole ton of it all over the place, because then you're just going to have, you know, thick, globby stencil everywhere. So you just want a little tiny bit. And then there's your stencil. So that's another cool way you can make texturing on your artwork or your art journal with your gesso. Thank you so much for watching today's how-to on how to play around with gesso. Hopefully you got some cool techniques out of it and you can go ahead and add some of those to your creative process. I'd love to see any other creative techniques that you come up with, so if you'd love to drop a comment, I'd love to see it. Bye-bye.